Well, thank you. It's remarkable to see all of you here in this amazing room. So, I hope we have an interesting and engaging time tonight. That's the plan. I have a lecture planned, so it's got a strange title. It's not that exciting, really. The first part of it is the socialization of the value hierarchy. And the second is, and the estimation of the magnitude of error. It's like, you wouldn't think you'd come and sit in here to listen to that talk, really, would you? I'm not sure I would, but it is interesting. It's a very, very interesting problem. And here's part of what the problem is, the part of the problem I'm trying to solve. Part of it is, how is your emotional stability tied up with your social identity? That's a really important question. And I think it might be the central question that I've been pursuing as long as I've been able to think intellectually. That might be the problem that I've been pursuing. Because one of the things I've been interested in is, why is it that people are so committed to their group identity, let's say, or their group beliefs, that they will, let's say, go to war to protect them, or to spread them, or that they will commit atrocities, hypothetically, in defense of them. So it's a very interesting problem, because people, when people think about the motivation for war, for example, they often attribute it to economic causes, and that just never struck me as plausible. Sometimes it's plausible, but it's not a deep solution as far as I'm concerned. It's more psychological. It's our beliefs are important to us. And what does it mean? Well, there's a lot of questions there. What do you mean by belief? Exactly. Physicists generally don't go to war over their belief in one physical theory over another, so it can't be just as simple as belief. It has to be more complicated than that. And people are committed to their beliefs too, and it isn't obvious what commitment means. And so those are the things that I've been trying to unpack. What does it mean to have a belief? And what does it mean? Why is it important to you? Why is it crucial to you? There's something associated deeply. There's a deep association between belief and value. And so then that brings up another question. What exactly do you mean by value? So that's three hard questions. And so that's part of it. And then, so that's the value hierarchy question, part of it. And then the error magnitude problem is, let's say you go to a party and you tell a joke, and you think it's a pretty funny joke. And you tell your joke, and no one laughs. And in fact, they look at you like you're rather odd. And then the question is, well, how should you respond to that? Like, what exactly does that indicate about you? I mean, does it indicate a minor flaw in an otherwise stellar personality? Because that's a possibility. Or does it mean that, like, you're a creep? Right? And maybe right down to the core. And you could even think the less that you think that it means that you're a creep, the more likely it is that you are one. So, but it's very hard to estimate the magnitude of an error. We have, how upset should you get when something that you don't want to happen happens? And it's very, very hard to figure that out. If you wake up in the morning and you have a pain, say, in your side, or you're not feeling particularly well, it's like, well, how upset should you get about that? And one answer is, well, like, maybe you're going to die in 3 months, maybe that's the beginning of pancreatic cancer and that's the end of you. And so maybe you should just be terrified into paralysis when you have a pain that you can't explain. Or maybe you should just brush it off and think, well, I'll get up and do what I usually do, and it's probably nothing. And sometimes you're right with the it's probably nothing approach, and sometimes if you don't go to the physician right away because you have some relatively trivial pain, then you're dead. And so this problem of estimating magnitude of error, importance of error, it's unbelievably difficult problem. And so I want to address both of those problems at the same time tonight. So that's the plan. So we'll see how that goes. So, and then I want to weave in there one more thing, which is this relationship between your own psychological structure, whatever that happens to be, your own value hierarchy, because there's a very tight relationship between your value hierarchy and your psychological structure, which is why hierarchies, by the way, are necessary, which is part of the point I was trying to make, say, in Rule 1 in 12 Rules for Life when I talked about hierarchies. There's no getting away from hierarchies. Because a hierarchy is a structure that tells you that one thing takes precedence over another, that one thing is more important than another, right? And if everything is of equal import, then nothing is more important than anything else, by definition. And then, well, what should you do? And the answer is, well, you can't tell, because nothing is any more important than anything else. And the definition of important, fundamentally, is something like that which you should do first. That constitutes importance. That's also something that's relevant, I would say, too, because a lot of the way that we look at the world is as a place to. We look at the world as a place in which to act, and we make a lot of judgments about the nature of the world in terms of how we should structure our action. In fact, the theory that I am putting forth in general is a theory that's predicated on the notion that the essential way that we look at the world is as if it's a forum of action, like a dramatic forum, like a story. That's a good way of thinking about it, that we really do view ourselves and our place in the world as a story that's set in a narrative landscape. And you might argue that that's not the case. You could say, well, that viewpoint, for example, has been superseded by a scientific viewpoint, but it isn't obvious to me that that's the case. And it certainly isn't. It's certainly not the case that we act that way. And it's certainly not the case that we structure our political systems that way. And it's certainly not the case that we treat each other that way, or that we think that way, or that we react emotionally that way. And so that's a lot. And, it's also the case that the other thing that's worth thinking about in this regard is, we've only been thinking about the world as an objective place for 500 years, something like that. I mean, maybe you could chase it back to the ancient Greeks and go back 2,000 years, but whatever. From a historical perspective, 500 years or 200 years is the same amount of time, and it's a tiny fraction of the amount of time that living creatures that were approximately like us have been around. So we got along fine without thinking about the world as an objective place for a very, very long time. We survived, and here we are. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but it does imply that there are other ways of looking at the world that are highly functional and that have been conserved for let's say, for evolutionary reasons. And so, if you make the case, which you might, that what you evolve to match is reality, at least you match it well enough so that reality doesn't kill you, which is more or less the definition of evolution. If you evolve to match reality in some sense, and the manner in which you evolve predisposes you to view the world as if it's a narrative of sorts, then possibly the world is a narrative of sorts, at least insofar as it concerns you. Now, what that means metaphysically, I don't know, but that's okay, because who knows anything metaphysically, virtually by definition. What's metaphysical is beyond what you know. You can speculate, but and so, I would speculate that there is something narrative about the structure of the world, but it doesn't matter. We don't have to go down that route. We can just think about this practically. So the first thing I want to tell you about that I think is really important to lay out the structure of this argument is something about the relationship between perception and emotion and motivation. And this is actually pretty simple, but people don't know it. And I guess it's simple in the way that complex things are simple when you think them through for a very long time. And understand them, and then can finally lay them out, in some manner that's rather, let's say, clear, because you understand them. I derived a fair bit of this information from a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety by a man named Jeffrey Gray, who I think was one of the two greatest neuropsychologists of the 20th century, two or three. His Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is on my list of recommended books, by the way, on my website, it's a really hard book. It took me like 6 months to read that book, and all of it was painful. And the reason for that was, books are interesting. Some aren't. Often I dog-ear the pages of books that I'm reading if I find a line or something, that I'd like to remember that I think is important. And, I have some books on my shelves that pages are dog-eared double because there was a really amazing thought on one page and there was a really amazing thought on the other page, the facing page. And so the whole damn thing is just nothing but dog ears. And then there's other books where there's zero. When I read Nietzsche, for example, there was lots of dog ears on Beyond Good and Evil, which is a great book. And Nietzsche actually, he came up with the most arrogant statement anybody ever made about himself as an author, which is really quite impressive. To come up with the most arrogant statement, that's really something. And he was great at coming up with one-liners, philosophical one-liners. He said, I can write in a sentence what it takes other people a book to write. And then he said, that they can't even write in a book. So that's pretty good, eh? It's like arrogant, and then he topped it. It's like, yes, this is a man who could really write. Anyways, the problem with reading a book like that, Beyond Good and Evil, say, is that every damn sentence is a thought, and a deep thought. And so reading Beyond Good and Evil, it's like just constantly being punched. I mean, partly you're punched because you read part of it and you don't know what the hell he says, and so then you're stupid, and so that's a punch. And then now and then you stumble across something you understand, and it's like, it's hard on you. He said he philosophized with a hammer, that he was breaking things apart, and there's no doubt about that. So now and then you run across something you understand, and then that breaks you apart because you understand it, and it takes a long time to go through the book because you have to think about it, and God, that's not good. Thinking about things, Well, it isn't, because, when you think about, you already know everything in some sense, You've got a map that covers the whole world, which is sort of why you can function. And so as long as everything's going fine, you don't really have to adjust your map, and you don't have to think. But then if you come across something that makes you think, then what that means is that part of the way you were thinking was wrong. And so when you think something, when you're forced to, then some little part of what you were, your map, the way you represent the world, it has to die because it was wrong. And then it has to be replaced by this new thing. And God only knows how much of what it was that was there has to die. That's part of the magnitude of error problem. And so people don't like to think. And so it's hard to read difficult books like Beyond Good and Evil because you're just forced to think, and it's just exhausting. You wish that he would just go away, which is why they're trying to not teach difficult books in universities anymore, so that people don't have to undergo the difficult process of actually having to think and transform themselves. Anyways, I read Jeffrey Gray's book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, and it was like that. He was something, man. Student of a psychologist named Hans Eysenck, who was the most cited psychologist in the 20th century, and really quite a good psychologist. He laid a lot of the groundwork for modern theories of temperament and personality. They've been modified since his work, but he got extroversion right. He was the first person to really identify extroversion in a manner that could be measured. Carl Jung actually invented the notion, but Eysenck figured out how to measure it, which is a big deal. And he also noted that there was another important personality dimension, neuroticism, which is the tendency towards negative emotion. And he got that right too, because that actually happened to be the case, and he figured out how to measure it. And so Eysenck was the first person who really established conceptually the fact that we have two fundamental emotional systems, one positive and one negative, that they're not opposites exactly. They're actually separate biological systems. So some people can be extroverted, which means they're quite happy and assertive. They smile a lot, they laugh a lot, they tell a lot of jokes, they like to party. They always like to be around people. That's an extroverted person. And they can also be unhappy, worried, anxious, depressed, frustrated, disappointed. I mean, living with someone like that's quite a trip because they're just all over the place. But, but there are people like that because you can be high in negative emotion and you can be high in positive emotion or low in both or whatever. And it's useful to know that. It's useful to know that about your partner and about the people around you. And if you are interested in this sort of thing, by the way, I have a personality test online at understandmyself.com, and you can go there, and it takes you about 15 minutes, and it gives you 5 dimensions of personality: extroversion, neuroticism, that's positive and negative emotion; agreeableness, which is it's probably the maternal instinct dimension, but at least it's the variance between compassion and competitive aggression. It's something like that, and that looks like a continuum. And there's another dimension, which is trait conscientiousness, which is integrity and dutifulness, orderliness, industriousness. And then finally, the 5th dimension, which is openness, which is like a hybrid between intelligence roughly, and creativity. And so you can go there and find out how you compare to other people. And that's kind of interesting and useful, because it's kind of useful to know who you are. And to know that that's actually who you are, that you have a nature. And some of that stuff's movable, but it's not as movable as you think. And the farther you want to move it, the harder it is to move. Like, you can take an introvert. You're an introvert if when you're around people, you get exhausted by it and you have to go off by yourself and recover. Then you're an introvert. And if you're an introvert, you don't really like being in groups. And so sales, maybe that's not for you, And that's a good thing to know, because if you're an introvert, why go be a salesperson and be miserable? Do something where you can spend time alone and not be miserable. That's better. You might as well match your occupation to your temperament rather than the other way around. Now, you can take an introvert. I've worked with lots of introverts who say had made pretty good progress in their careers, and they were at a point where they had to do a lot of social networking, and otherwise they were going to hit a plateau in their career. And they could be taught the skills of extroversion sort of one at a time, rather painfully. So they could learn them, they could accrue the skills, and that would broaden their personality outward into the, say, extroverted end of the continuum. But it didn't make them extroverts. And so they were still temperamentally introverts. And so, if you're a neurotic person, high in negative emotion, you can learn to regulate your anxiety and so forth. But you hit a point of diminishing returns, and it's difficult. It's effortful. So, anyways, back to Eysenck and then back to Jeffrey Gray. So Eysenck identified extroversion and introversion, or extroversion and neuroticism, and that's going to be very important in a minute. And Gray elaborated Eysenck's theories to a large degree, but he did that neurologically. He was a master of the animal experimental literature. And a lot of that's being phased out of universities because the regulations for animal experimentation have become so onerous and difficult that it's much easier for beginning scientists just not to bother. And that's a real catastrophe, because we have learned a lot about the brain in the last 50 years, a lot. And we've learned very little about the brain from PET scans and MRI scans and like that complicated technology that's used to study human beings, and an unbelievable amount by studying animals. And you might think, rats in particular, and you might think, well, rats, why? They're not much like human beings, but that's wrong. You share, I don't know what it is, 98.5% of your genetic structure with rats. Some of you probably more than that.